Ever feel like you're trying to decipher, I don't know, a secret code when you come across complex information? You want the understanding, right? But without the headache of wading through tons of jargon. Well, you've landed in the right place. Welcome to the Deep Dive, where your express route to genuinely grasping intricate subjects. We pull out the crucial insights, maybe even surprise you a little.
Think of us as your sense-making partners, yeah. Today, we're tackling the scientific side of psychological research. We'll be looking at how psychologists try to understand, the complexities of psychological disorders, the really critical role that good experiments with clear variables play, and also why defining our terms, like really precisely, is so important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've got a really interesting set of materials here. Actually, stuff used to teach AP psychology. Now, don't let AP scare you off. It just means we're getting right to the core of how psychological research is done, the specific language they use, the fundamental science that makes it all work. Our goal is for you to walk away with a really solid grasp of these concepts, feeling enlightened, not, overwhelmed. Okay, so let's dive right in. Psychology, it is a science, right? Seems obvious, but what does that really mean in practice?
That's a great starting point, seriously.
Mhm.
What makes psychology a science is its rigorous commitment to the scientific method. It's not just watching people. It's about forming hypotheses you can actually test.
Yep.
And gathering empirical evidence data, basically. Stuff we can observe and measure to see if those hypotheses hold up. Think about Wilhelm Wundt back in the late 19th century. Setting up that first psychology lab, that was huge. It marked a real shift towards studying the mind through experiments. A turning point.
Right. Experimentation. And it's not just the experiments themselves, but the language too.
Mm-hmm.
The sources we looked at really stressed how vital it is to use specific scientific definitions. We all talk about stress or happiness, but in research, those words need like super precise meanings.
Absolutely. That's key. The casual way we might use those terms in, pop psychology, it can be miles away from the scientific definition. It's about getting beyond just gut feelings and arriving at clear, measurable concepts we can actually study.
Okay, so psychology research isn't just one big thing. There are different kinds.
Precisely. Our sources highlight two main types, basic research and applied research. Think of basic research as foundational exploration. It's driven by wanting to understand fundamental questions about how things work. So researchers might investigate memory or how different brain parts handle emotions. The goal is just expanding our core understanding.
So it's the groundwork, figuring out the why and how fundamentally.
Hmm.
And then applied research takes that knowledge and
Tries to solve practical problems in the real world. So if basic research helps us get how learning works, applied research might compare teaching methods to see which works best in a classroom, or maybe testing how well a new therapy for anxiety works. The focus is on practical solutions. It's kind of a cycle, really. Basic research informs applied, and sometimes problems in applied settings spark new basic questions.
that makes perfect sense. Basic research figures out flight principles. Applied research builds the better plane. Got it. Now let's maybe switch gears a bit and talk about psychological disorders. That's a complex area. Our sources mention the main tool used here.
Yes, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, the 5th edition. It's the standard classification system mental health professionals use for diagnosis. What's interesting, though, is that the DSM-5 mainly focuses on listing the specific symptoms for each disorder. It doesn't focus so much on the underlying causes or specific treatments.
Symptoms, not causes. Why do they take that approach?
Well, psychology has lots of different perspectives, right? Biological, cognitive, social. And each one offers different explanations for why disorders develop. So by focusing on observable symptoms, things people report or that can be seen, the DSM gives a common language, a set of criteria everyone can use for diagnosis, even if they disagree on the why. It's pragmatic, really.
Okay, so it's about creating a shared description, even if the cause is debated. That makes sense. The sources cover some big categories. Let's start with somatic symptom and related disorders.
Right. These involve someone experiencing physical symptoms, real symptoms suggesting a medical issue, but where doctors can't find a clear medical cause. Conversion disorder is a classic example. Someone might suddenly develop paralysis or lose their sight. They genuinely experience it, but medical tests find no physical explanation. It's worth noting the DSM has evolved here. It acknowledges that just because there's no medical cause found, it doesn't automatically mean it's psychological. It's complex.
Okay. Then there are dissociative disorders.
Yeah.
What's the main idea there?
The dissociative disorders involve disruptions. Disruptions in a person's sense of identity, their memory, or consciousness. Dissociative identity disorder, DID, what people used to call multiple personality disorder, is probably the best known example. It involves having two or more distinct personality states. Understanding DD is still developing. Some theories link it to severe trauma, kind of a coping mechanism, while others look more at social learning or cognitive factors. It's quite debated.
And schizophrenic disorders, what are the key things to look for?
The defining feature there is significant disturbance in thinking and perception. Big disruptions. This can mean delusions, really strong beliefs not based in reality, or hallucinations, sensory experiences without any real stimulus, like hearing voices. Also, disorganized thinking, where speech might jump around illogically, and unusual movements or emotional expressions. Experiencing a hallucination, like hearing a voice commenting on what you're doing, that's considered a positive symptom, meaning something added, something present that isn't usually. The causes, believed to be a mix of genetic vulnerability and environmental factors. It's complicated.
Personality disorders also get a mention. What makes them distinct?
Personality disorders are about long-lasting, inflexible patterns of inner experience and behavior. These patterns are really different from cultural expectations. They show up across many situations, and they cause distress or problems in functioning. Antisocial personality disorder is one example, showing a persistent lack of regard for others' rights and feelings.
Okay. And then obsessive compulsive and related disorders.
Yeah, OCD and related ones. These involve obsessions, recurrent, intrusive thoughts that cause a lot of anxiety, and compulsions, repetitive behaviors, or mental acts someone feels driven to do, often to reduce the anxiety from the obsession. OCD itself is the main one, but things like hoarding disorder or body dysmorphic disorder fall into this category too.
Right. Or finally, trauma and stressor-related disorders. PTSD is the big one here.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, yeah. PTSD is a key example. It can develop after experiencing or witnessing a really terrifying event. Symptoms include things like intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, trying to avoid anything related to the trauma, negative mood changes, and being hyper alert or easily startled.
There was an interesting side note in there about IQ scores, too. What was the gist of that?
Ah, yes. The source mentioned you'd expect the biggest range, the largest standard deviation, in IQ scores in a really diverse group, like, say, all the kids in a large public elementary school system. Because you'd have a huge mix of backgrounds, opportunities, maybe genetic factors, all influencing cognitive development.
Okay, that makes sense. More diversity, more variability. So we've covered the science basis and looked at how disorders are understood. Now, let's get into the nuts and bolts of research, dependent and independent variables. This feels crucial for understanding how we actually test psychological ideas.
Absolutely crucial. At the heart of a lot of research is understanding relationships between things. That's where hypotheses come in. A hypothesis is basically your testable prediction about how two or more variables relate. And variables. Simply put, they're just things that can change or vary between people in your study, like age, stress level, height, anything.
And this is where independent and dependent variables are key, right?
Precisely. In an experiment, you're usually looking to see if one variable causes an effect on another. The independent variable, that's the one the researcher changes or manipulates. It's the potential cause. The dependent variable, that's what the researcher measures to see if it was affected by the independent variable. It's the potential effect. Our sources had that classic example. Watching violent TV makes people more aggressive.
Okay, so in that case, the violent TV, watching maybe how many hours they watch, that's the independent variable, the thing you change between groups.
You got it.
And then aggression may be measured by how they act in a certain task. That's the dependent variable, the outcome you measure.
Exactly. You're looking to see if changing the amount of violent TV, IV, changes the level of aggression, DV. And to test that, you typically have an experimental group. They did the independent variable. They watch the violent TV. And then you need a control group. They don't get the treatment. Or maybe they watch nonviolent TV. They're your baseline for comparison.
Right, like that Mozart effect example. If you want to see if Mozart helps test scores, the Mozart listeners are the experimental group. And the ones who maybe sit in silence or listen to something else, they're the control group.
Precisely. The control group lets you isolate the effect of the thing you're actually interested in, the independent variable. But just having two groups isn't quite enough. How do you make sure the groups weren't just different to begin with?
That would be random assignment, correct. making sure people end up in groups by chance.
That's right. Random assignment is critical. It means every participant has an equal chance of being put in the experimental group or the control group. This helps to kind of spread out any pre-existing differences between people, participant, relevant confounding variables, the technical term, things like natural intelligence or mood that day, whatever. If you randomize, those differences should hopefully balance out between the groups. It makes it much more likely the groups are similar before you introduce the independent variable.
Makes perfect sense. You need to isolate the effect of what you're changing. Okay, so the last piece of this research puzzle we need is operational definitions. Sounds a bit technical. Why is this so important?
It does sound technical, but it's absolutely essential. Essential for making research reliable and replicable. An operational definition gives a clear, precise, measurable way to define your variables. It tells everyone exactly how you measured or manipulated something in your study. Think of it like translating an abstract idea, like memory, into something concrete you can actually observe and count.
Can you give us an example? The sources mentioned something about people changing their answers.
Yes, in one example, whether people changed their answers or not was used. Now, in that specific case, the student in the example got it mixed up with the dependent variable itself. But the idea of making it measurable is the key point of an operational definition. So instead of just studying conformity, which is vague, a researcher might operationally define it as the number of times a participant publicly agrees with an obviously wrong answer given by Confederates in the Asch conformity task. See? Very specific.
Okay, so taking something fuzzy like stress and defining it for this specific study as, say, a score over 50 on the perceived stress scale, or maybe an increase in cortisol levels measured in saliva.
Exactly that. Without clear operational definitions, research becomes really messy. How can you compare results from two studies on aggression if they measured it in completely different ways? You can't. It also makes it hard, if not impossible, for someone else to replicate your study to see if they get the same results. That example with Charlotte and Tamar measuring friendliness, it highlights the problem perfectly. If they don't have a shared, clear, operational definition, maybe number of times the person initiated positive social interaction in 5 minutes, their ratings are going to be all over the place, unreliable.
So operational definitions bring the clarity and the consistency needed for psychology to be a cumulative science. We can build on each other's work because we know what was actually done.
Precisely. They're fundamental. They help ensure research is reliable, consistent measurement, and also valid that it's actually measuring what it claims to measure.
Well, this has been a really enlightening deep dive.
Yeah.
Seriously, into the foundations of psychological research. We look at psychology as a science, how disorders are approached via symptoms using the DSM, the vital roles of dependent and independent variables in experiments, and why those precise operational definitions are just non-negotiable for good research.
Yeah, and understanding these core ideas really gives you a much stronger toolkit. A toolkit for evaluating the psychological information and research claims you run into every day. It helps you think more critically about what's being said and, importantly, the evidence behind it.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Next time you see some research claim, maybe in the news or online, pause for a second. Ask yourself, how clearly are the key ideas defined? Are the variables, the outcomes, actually specific and measurable? A lack of those clear operational definitions. It might just be a little red flag suggesting the claims aren't built on the most solid ground. Definitely something to think about. Until our next deep dive, keep thinking critically.